If you need to go, please feel free to do so.
I think, Leon, on this thing, it's really no different. Your major thesis for what puts South Africa right in terms of deregulating, getting government edicts out of society, applies just as much on a world basis. And that's really the problem with what we tried to do with certain strategic industries and banks, where we had to have more than 50% of. We were trying to impose regulations on a world basis. Now, some of this disinvestment thing is the same thing. And the only argument I found that makes any sense at all to Americans is nothing to do with South Africa. You say to them, this is an infringement on your freedoms in America, which goes quite contrary to the whole history of the American nation. That's the only thing that I have found that makes any sense to them at all.
By the way, there could be some very disturbing implications for the United States and for the specific banks that triggered this off, because they've acted on non-financial grounds. And what has happened is that a relatively rich country has defaulted. If we get away with it, which it looks as though we are going to get away with it, there won't be a government in Latin America that won't want to do the same thing. They're much poorer countries than we are.
I mean, it's given Mexico ideas.
Yes, particularly the Brazilians, I think.
A comment on the question of tariffs. If ever there was a time for South Africa to abandon tariffs, it's now, because the low value of the rand gives the South African companies much greater protection than they had with tariffs. You know, as far as percentage-wise.
You need to payment switch.
We're actually on the verge of an explosion, I think, I mean, a favourable explosion.
Yes,
The question is how long it's going to last, because there are some very disturbing repercussions a little further down the road. I mean, just study what the exchange rate change has done to our exporting and our importing, import competing industries. It's
yes.
just incredible.
If you take it percentage-wise, how much has the rand dropped?
Well, it depends if we're looking trade-weighted or the dollar, but I mean, it's well under half of what it was 18 months ago in dollar terms, and probably on trade-weighted not significantly different.
And tariff protection is generally 20%?
Well, there's no average.
20%, if you want to take an average, but there's tremendous variation.
Yes, but the highest would be about 40%.
No, some are over 100.
Some are not.
Motocross, crockery.
Oh, yeah.
And also, I believe that import control, although nothing has been said about it publicly, but in recent months, import control has been starting to be applied in kind of indirect ways and subtle ways, licensing and these kind of.
Despite the disincentive of the low value of the rand.
What they call off-tariff protection. There are all kinds of ways of having protection without having tariffs.
But I think what is very disturbing, and you didn't make the point here, is that what happened last week is a major step backwards from the whole free market movement in South Africa. And it may be catastrophic. What the public is not aware of is that it was a decision by the government in violation of the Reserve Bank recommendation. The Reserve Bank was against this. And they were the people who, after all, were having to handle the balance of payments problem in the Reserve Bank.
What do you think would have happened, Mr. Spring, if we hadn't done it? Presumably the rand would have gone down to 20 cents.
Or maybe 10 or maybe 5. At what point do you think?
All of a sudden the money would come in because there's a bargain. So in a month the whole
I'm
problem's over.
informed that in fact just before the default, Swiss banks are already starting to advise their clients to start putting money into South Africa, because in Swiss franc terms, the real assets like property have become absurdly cheap in South Africa to offset any kind of political risk.
Well, let me add, I was in Italy last week and I could not buy rands. I wanted to exchange my lira back to rands before returning, and there were no rands. They quoted the rand at a ridiculous. This was after the lira had collapsed, after Black Friday on the lira. Even then they were quoting the rand at an absurdly low rate. and the rand was not available. I mean, it was saying you can have cheap rands, but we're out of stock.
So you're suggesting, Mr. Spring, it might have been less than a month before the position was so correct?
Well, a lot of people in the Reserve Bank.
That's my
You
view.
know, you might ask them why does government do it? Well, of course, there was a very difficult situation, admittedly, in terms of the shortage of dollars, our reserves being very low. I mean, it was a difficult situation. The two things that seemed to have pushed it was, first of all, pure politics, to save the face of the government. The government is under tremendous pressure now from all kinds of groups, some rightly, some wrongly. But they're being accused of being an incredibly weak government. And the currency is seen as a kind of symbol of this weakness. Look at what has happened to the rand. Everybody could see what has happened to the rand. And therefore they tried to fix the phenomenon. But there was another reason I suspect I'm trying to get more evidence on it, and that is that some very powerful vested interests were facing an absolute financial crisis because they borrowed far too heavily overseas, had huge uncovered positions, and they could be in an extremely serious situation. And they were putting pressure on the government to stop it. The irony, of course, is it doesn't seem to be working, as you're aware.
Yes. And in fact, predictably it wouldn't work, because it's a message to the rest of the world that we don't trust our own currency. And that those who might have been wanting to come and buy land or buy shares or invest here are now advised against it by our own policy.
The longer-term implications are very disturbing. First of all, in the short term, relatively short term, we're going to face a continued outflow of capital. First of all, because there were things happening in the market to do with importers having to buy dollars to pay cash and so on for imports. Things like that are having a depressing effect on the currency. But then the moment we get out of that, there will be the rescheduling, so-called. And the message I get is that we're going to be paying a lot of money. We're going to be paying off a lot of loans, only to show what decent guys we really are. The problem then comes after that, because if we get economic recovery, we're not going to be in this recession forever, and we're not. We start sucking in imports. The balance of payments of the current account goes into deficit. There will be no capital coming into balance.
Right.
So it is all, the strain is going to be taken entirely on the currency, probably towards the end of next year in 87. And the next point is that we are a third world country. We should be a capital importer. And without the, not that capital imports have been of huge importance, to be quite honest, but they have been on the right side. They have helped our development. And in the future, there is going to be none of that.
Yeah.
Which of course is going to mean something else, that we're going to have to generate all our capital domestically, which means that interest rates in real terms are going to go to very high levels. They will have to, because they're going to have to do two things. They're going to have to ration capital and make it very expensive. Think of the implications of that: infrastructure, black housing, schools, and all the rest of it. Capital is going to become very expensive. And of course also we have to encourage the generation of capital. In other words, we have to encourage savings, so we have to give people high real returns. And unless you think inflation is going to drop, that can only be done with two things: high interest rates and possibly tax concessions on interest and dividend earnings. We're into a totally new ballgame. It's going to be a completely new kind of economy and a new kind of society, almost irrespective of what happens politically, say 2 years down the line.
Yeah, in fact, I believe that now the economic factors have overtaken political factors as determinants of the course of events. Now, that is not to say the political factors, the unrest, the various postures and lobbying are unimportant. It's a manifestation of what crisis proportions the economic factors have reached, as it seems to me. You did say that we have stopped disinvestment. What we've done is we've stopped divestment, but it's probably further self-imposed disinvestment in the sense of new investment. In other words, we have now made another contribution self-imposed contribution to the disinvestment campaign, in the sense that anyone who would have invested will be now less inclined to invest. So we're really doing it all for them. We are getting increasingly to the point where Reagan might as well just say, well, it's all been done for us by South Africa, and it saves him the political embarrassment of having to officially suspend a constructive engagement.
Well, it gets a little more difficult now, because what you in fact got to say to an American company if you force them to sell is they're saying, let the Japanese or a German or a Swiss company take it over. Because there's no, I mean, you may theoretically sell to a South African company, but the way the financial rand market works, you can only transfer assets through to another foreigner. Maybe not directly, maybe 2, 3, 4 positions removed, but on balance, it has to be with another foreigner.
Okay, anything to move off, unless there's more to contribute on the financial situation? Anything more?
Can I do just a little bit again? If you bring the tax rate down to 25%, make it a flat rate, you don't do much to the tax collection at an existing distribution. The actual income gradient will go up very, very steeply. You'll collect more tax than you need, and you'll have all the capital you want quite within, say, around about 6 years. You'll develop your own capital. It's automatic. As soon as you unequalize the incomes, people must save because they just can't spend those astronomical quantities of money. And we can become an exporter of capital if we wanted to.
Yes, if I can sort of use that to add a somewhat divergent link onto. We have in the Free Market Foundation been very actively involved, and more particularly has Ian Hetherington over there been involved in tax questions. There are two things that need to be shared with you here. One is that I believe is an open secret. I think it's already been in the press, although I'm not sure, that it is speculated or believed that the Margot Commission on Tax is either likely to recommend or is very seriously considering recommending the introduction of a flat tax rate of 20 to 25% with an initial exemption. Now that's particularly interesting because three of us here were instrumental to the introduction of the Tax Act in Ciskei, which is a flat tax rate of 15%, with the first 8,000 being tax-free, which means that 90% of Ciskeians who used to be taxpayers are now no longer taxpayers, i.e. it's pro the poor, unlike people tend to think flat tax rates are. But the early evidence suggests that they are going to be gathering more revenue than they used to collect under the South African tax structure. Also what they did is they kept the sales tax at 10% instead of raising it with South Africa to 12%. Already the monthly returns show that they have a more than 50% increase in revenue from sales tax, increase from lowered rates. And all the evidence so far, which is still very early and very unreliable and could be false signals, but nonetheless to the extent that it's available, suggests that the lower flat tax rate is going to produce more government revenue. Certainly Ciskei is experiencing very high growth, 8% or so, an influx of industries and capital, and everything seems to be working according to plan, according to supply side or Laffer curve or free market theory, and so far we're feeling very confident that these policies are the correct ones, even in the most unfashionable political climate. There's probably nowhere in the world which is as unpopular and unfashionable politically as Ciskei. It's the pariah of pariahs. And even there it works. And if it works there, well then it's got to work anywhere.
Any more questions? I'd like to remind you that the next meeting will be on Wednesday, the 25th of September. The topic, poverty and hope in the current political debate. And I'd urge any of you who can to attend that. There is a break of 16 days. This is to allow Leon time to travel to America to participate in an anti-disinvestment seminar. That is, if the organisers can put it together. And
No, it's not an anti-disinvestment. It's just a disinvestment seminar. It's not anti-disinvestment. In fact, myself, I'm ambivalent. But just let's explain.
Okay. Have it as you will. And I'm sure you'll all join with me in thanking Leon for an eloquent, cogent, and very excellent presentation.
Do we get more drinks? Roger? Half an hour. 3/4 This discussion crops up in between. That's why it's taken long.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I don't even know what your subject is tonight. I just know.
The current political situation.
I've been asked to introduce Leon tonight. I think that Eustace probably felt that if you can't change the speaker, the least you can do is maybe change the person who's introducing him. My name is Terry Markman, and I'm a council member of the Free Market Foundation. I'm sure that all of you know Leon a lot better than you know me, so perhaps Leon should have done the introducing. Can I just, as a matter of interest, find out if anybody has not been to either of the first two seminars? Can you just show me one? Oh, so there are quite a few of you. Well then, just briefly to tell you what this is all about. Leon has been coerced, I think, into giving a set of 8 seminars. I see Eustace is smiling.
Voluntary.
Huh?
Entirely voluntary.
Involuntary, I understand that. The purpose of these 8 seminars is that they will be directed towards the production of a book, which is loosely called at the moment Solving South Africa's Problems. And in fact, perhaps while you're thinking of questions to ask him, you can also be thinking of possible other alternative, other titles for the book. And what Leon has done is he's giving these 8 seminars, 8 discussions, on the basis that each seminar will roughly form a chapter of his book. And the purpose of doing this is twofold. One is it commits him to write a chapter effectively every week, and secondly, to get some feedback from people about the points that he's making, and hopefully to get useful information from you so that when the book comes out, it's more or less in the right direction, and I'm sure that it will be. I think that Leon is quite happy for, as he's talking along, for you to interrupt on an informal basis. Really, we would like to have a very informal discussion. He will make the decision as to whether or not your question is going to be answered later on in his talk, or whether it's inappropriate to answer at that point in time. But please feel free just to make any comment as you go along, because it's more pertinent at that point in time. And without any ado, I'd like you just to welcome Leon, and he's going to speak now.
I think we need this one here. Thank you. To encourage informality, I'm going to take off my jacket, which is also a way to overcome the heat of being nervous about addressing an audience. Oh, I see. Okay. Does that do it? Yeah. The subject today is poverty and hope in South Africa's current political situation. And what I intend to do is to analyze the current political groupings, including the labor groupings in South Africa, which, although personally I don't find this type of analysis as relevant as obviously the media do, and therefore most people do, because the media cater for public demand, it's nonetheless necessary because these groupings are important. That is to say, the various political parties, people like the ANC, the Weerstandsbeweging, the trade unions, and so on. Who are they? Where do they fit into the scheme of things? What are their various positions? How do they differ from each other? How representative are they? And how ultimately would they need to fit into a solution to South Africa's problems? What is striking is that the numbers that of followers that any one of these groupings have is a lot smaller than one might think relative to the prominence which they get, and that includes even the prominent white political parties as a percentage of white electorate. They have surprisingly small actual memberships and following, and also they all seem to have a quite large floating membership. People don't seem to be very strongly committed, at least anymore, to whichever grouping they might belong. They used to be very much more committed, perhaps during the 50s and 60s. There was a very clear delineation between the United Party, the National Party, the Progressive Party, the ANC, the PAC, the Liberal Party, and so on. Those delineations have now fallen away. All sorts of a proliferation of splinter groups have cropped up in between, and it's now very difficult, I find, to establish exactly who's who and what's what. I've been criticized, incidentally, for something, and that is that normally when I speak, in fact invariably when I speak, other than in these sessions, I tend to tell lots of stories, and people who know me sort of know me as being somewhat of perhaps an amusing speaker, and I haven't been doing it here, and people have said, why am I treating it so solemnly? And so, well, I do have one or two stories for you, and that is the rather nice introductory story about how long I'm going to take, and with that let me set my stopwatch going. With interruptions, I expect to take about 45 minutes, and that means that by and large you listen to what I'm here to do is talk to you for 45, you're here to listen to me for 45, and I think the punchline to this is that if you finish before me, please let me know. The other story I like to tell is as a free marketeer about the speaker at Hyde Park Corner who, like me, was trying to solve the problems of Britain. I'm trying to solve them in South Africa, and he said, after the revolution we will all have strawberries and cream. And somebody said, but I don't like strawberries and cream, a heckler. And the speaker said, after the revolution you will like strawberries and cream. The other one, which is a rather very nice joke, I think, is about when when Brezhnev visited Jimmy Carter in the White House. Did I tell this one at one of the sessions? If not, it's really worth telling. There's actually a clandestine joke from the USSR. I have a little red book, not Mao's little red book, but it's a little red book of clandestine jokes, banned jokes from Russia. Very delightful little book this is. And one of them in it is about when Brezhnev visited Carter and said to him, I believe you here in the USA have private telephones, and that's very hard. Is that true? And Carter said yes. And he didn't incidentally visit Carter for the political analysts here, but if he didn't, I couldn't tell the story, so I have to pretend he did. Anyway, he said, can it really work? You know, we can't conceive of private telephones in Russia, as we from South Africa can't. You know, when Helen Suzman was, this is actually true, Helen Suzman was in Russia, in Moscow earlier this year at a conference with her husband, was interviewed by Pravda, and when they asked her how does she find Russia, she said, sort of Freudian slip, very much like South Africa. Anyhow, what happened is he said, yes, we do have private telephones. He says, they really work. He said, they're unbelievable, cheap, efficient, there are no waiting lists. You can get them at the local hardware store, ones with polka dot stripes, any color you like, big, small, in your car, in your handbag, and there are no waiting lists, and they've got all these fantastic services, holding services, conference discussions. You can phone all through your mistresses at the same time, and all sorts of things. And then he said, and our latest service is fantastic. You know, we have these dialing services. You can dial a joke, and dial a prayer, and dial a politician, and dial a prostitute, and dial an alcoholic, or Alcoholics Anonymous and stuff. And now, he says, you can actually dial hell. And Brezhnev said, you mean I can phone Stalin and Engels and Lenin and Mao and Trotsky? And he said, yes. He said, that's unbelievable. And you mean I can then find out why our 5-year plans go wrong in the first year every time? Sure, he said. So he phoned Stalin, spoke to Stalin, put on the phone, and the operator said that was 3 minutes, $150. And Brezhnev was dazzled, stunned. He went back to Russia. He said, we must have a line through to the Kremlin. They worked away at it, eventually connected him through, spoke to Stalin. put on the phone, and the operator said that was 5 minutes, 5 rubles. And he said, that's fantastic. I always knew Soviet technology was better. What costs Americans $150 costs us only 5 rubles. And the operator said, no, sir, for Americans it's a long-distance call. Anyhow, oh dear, this is very low. Can everyone see that? Is anyone who can't? Because one can make the screen higher. Is it uncomfortable, awkward? Yeah. Oh. The little levers are broken. Let's see.
Why don't we try that one?
Why don't we just try that? No. Whoops. You see, if we were real good free marketers, we just leave this. Now this is an arrangement of the various political groupings, not all of them, but the major ones, major in terms not necessarily of size of following, but in terms of their prominence, visibility, influence on the course of events, and the attention the media gives them. The reason why they're not in terms of following is because it's almost impossible to determine what the following is of the various groupings in South Africa. For example, the PAC, which certainly in its day had a sizable following, especially or almost entirely amongst blacks. In fact, it's a black organization, unlike the ANC, which is multiracial. But it's almost impossible to get some idea, even from members of the PAC, what kind of following they have, and they themselves can't really make a meaningful estimate. And if you take a thing like the Marxist Workers' Tendency, it's even difficult to establish whether it still exists. It was a splinter group from the ANC that left on account of the fact that the ANC would not adopt an unambiguously Marxist platform. There's a sort of ringing noise in the background. Is that bothering anyone? Has it gone? No. Oh well. Sorry? Oh, I see. It's the fan inside here. We'll just need to live with that. I'm sorry. But starting with the far right, there are in fact groupings further right than the Afrikaanse Weerstandsbeweging, believe it or not. And they're quite sort of curious types. There's the out-and-out Nazi parties, Nazi both in the sense of anti-Semitic and in the sense of anti-black, who actually do believe that races other than the Aryans should be subjugated or exterminated or whatever. And these groups do function within South Africa, and in some sense they are further right politically. But let's start with the Weerstandsbeweging. The Weerstandsbeweging is a group of Afrikaners that operates outside the political party structure, and they are hardcore Verwoerdians. Their position is essentially that they believe that you should have exclusive white areas into which blacks go only as daytime workers. They would not, for example, permit domestic workers to stay in servants' quarters or workers' rooms in white areas. They would have very rigid segregation. For example, a thing like a clothing shop would need to sell to whites or blacks or Indians or coloreds or whatever. There would be a quite extreme segregation, going beyond even what Verwoerd envisaged. Verwoerd himself, contrary to what people nowadays think in retrospect, was more concerned about political segregation than social and economic segregation. He would not himself have wanted that degree of actual social and physical segregation. Then there's the Oxy Aya something. I couldn't remember it for the time being. I don't know if anyone here does. Aya Toekoms, that's it. Oxy Aya Toekoms. For some reason I was thinking of Aya Thuisland, but I don't think they would approve. But anyway, Oxy Aya Toekoms is again similar to the Afrikaanse Weerstandsbeweging, and really on the far right of South African politics. Mentioning right and left, by the way, I must make the observation, which is very confusing and difficult for free market or libertarian or classical liberal or even federalist people to handle, and that is that South African political spectrum is divided according to people's position on race policy and not according to people's position on any other policy. In other words, in South Africa, the political parties, according to their leftness or rightness, do not need to take positions on economic policy, on social policy, on welfare policy, on education policy, or whatever, in the way they would have to do in other Western, any Western country. So that left to right over here means left to right in terms of race policy, whereas you would find amongst people right up near the top here, even members of the HNP, of SABRA, for example, who consider themselves to be staunch free marketeers, you will find similar people right down in the ANC who consider themselves to be staunch free marketeers. And we, in the free market movement, do find this peculiar dichotomy. So it's left or right, and peculiarly in the South African race policy sense of the word. Then you get SABRA, which doesn't see itself as a political grouping, but as an Afrikaans cultural organization. But what its members are in favor of, most of them at any rate, is the creation of an Africana homeland. And I mean, Oxy Aya Thuisland would actually be an appropriate name for them. And some of them, most of them, I think, are of the view that they're quite willing to buy up the land themselves, somewhere in the Karoo or the Free State, and then have themselves literally excised from South Africa, and they will be just simply only whites. There will be no blacks in there for any purpose whatsoever. They will do their own farm labor, run their own machines, do their own domestic work or whatever. Amongst their members are ones who are less extreme, who simply just want a territory in which Afrikaners or whites at any rate do have exclusive control over themselves politically, and then they really don't mind so much what happens to the rest of Southern Africa. They're quite happy for it to undergo political integration or change. In fact, some of their literature I'd commend to you to read, especially if you generally read literature of the other side. I know in this room here with us now are people who would tend to read, if you like, the more right-wing literature, and people who would tend to read the more left-wing literature. And I think a lot of insights can be gained if you take the time off to read the literature from the other side for a change. Now, this here, for example, is a fairly good book, compellingly argued, from Dr. Brevet, who would, I'm not sure if he actually belongs to one of these groupings, I can't establish that, but he's somewhere, say, in those top three. And this book, called Republiek Africana, A Thuisland vir die Afrikaner, is essentially says, well, you know, we have to accept that there's going to be integration and change, and that apartheid has to go. And the solution to the problem is, for those of us who really, like himself, who really feel strongly about segregation or political survival or cultural identity or whatever one wants to call it, of Afrikaners, will hive off into their own republic, which will be called the Republic of Africana. Now, he's got a significant following amongst right-wing Afrikaners, but the irony about this position is that it is not entirely irreconcilable with the position of, say, the PAC, which is down here somewhere, who want black power, who say that we want all or most of South Africa under the control of blacks. And the irony is, often these things are a circle, and you find, in fact, there's a great deal to reconcile between the ones right up there and the ones right down here, surprisingly, or with the ZAPO for that matter. I was giving a talk at University of the North last year, and afterwards was talking to some of the students, and the students there were divided essentially into moderate and radical students. And there was a radical, and a ZAPO radical, i.e. within a ZAPO, he's to the radical left of a ZAPO, and he was very militant and so on. When I left, I shook hands with all of them, after a very friendly discussion, and he stood back and he said, "I don't shake hands with whites," and very aggressively and unfriendly type. So I said to him, "Oh, well, you must be the local representative of the HNP because they don't shake hands with blacks." Anyway, what happened, I gathered, is that from that point on, and I believe to this day that's the position, is that the radical left students at the University of the North are now called the Black HNP. And this is one of the extreme ironies of the thing, that there really is a great similarity in the position between people there and there. They both dislike each other equally, and this, in a way, is source for hope. It means that we might well find an easier accommodation than is generally assumed possible with supposedly opposing groupings. Now, I don't know if you can see it from there, but they have a very optimistic view of where the white homeland will be. It stretches up to the Kruger Park, includes it, then most of the sort of the platteland areas, but the optimism arises by the fact that the whole Witwatersrand PWV complex is included. Then it's more realistic in the sense that the Free State, Northern Cape, the Karoo are included, and excluded are, for example, Port Elizabeth, Durban, East London, Cape Town, and most of the Cape Province, all of Natal, except for Vryheid, which I personally have a fondness for myself, since it was the Vryheid Republic and it had a limited government, personal freedom constitution. So maybe that's something that we can all feel a sense of possessiveness about, as they do. But nonetheless, I'm sure that there's, in their own minds, a lot of bargaining power involved in this. In other words, they're willing to be knocked back and give up, and ultimately they want to end up somewhere, and the rest of South Africa then can go its own way. Then, of course, on the other side, you have things like the Freedom Charter, which itself is a very ambiguous document. Although people on the right tend to condemn it as Marxist, socialist, whatever, it's very ambiguous. It presumes within the Freedom Charter that there will be freehold title, private land ownership. It presumes that most commerce and industry will be private. It talks only about nationalizing the banks and what they call monopoly industry. Now, when Tony Bloom and Gavin Reilly spoke to the ANC people a few weeks ago, they said, "What do you mean by monopoly industry?" And they said Anglo-American and Barlow Rand. In other words, they're quite happy for Sanlam and Federale Volksbeleggings and Gencor and SA Breweries and Premier Milling and all the rest to remain private, according to what they put forward there. And then, presumably, in their own scheme of things, there's some bargaining power included as well. In other words, which is why, as I said, you had various, this is just one of the breakaway groups, the Marxist Workers' Tendency. There have been about 4 or 5 breakaway groups from the ANC, because the ANC has, contrary to what many conservatives or moderates might expect, stuck against a lot of pressure to a sort of moderate or what the Marxists would call a sellout position. I don't know if any of you followed in Business Day the editorial debate between Duncan Innes and the editor, what's his name again? Ken Owen, in which Duncan Innes has been saying that the Freedom Charter is a bourgeois capitalist document and has to be rejected by Marxists, as he is one, Duncan Innes. And that, in a sense, has some truth. But mainly it's ambiguous. It could be either way. It could be, it's all things to all people, really. Luke 7 or wherever that comes from. There's a very good article to which I would commend you on the left, that is from there downwards, in Frontline of August 1985, written by Duncan Innes, himself a Marxist, and I think it sums up the position amongst the left groups as well as you'll get it anywhere, and anyone who wants to know more about them should get that article and read it. I will be touching on some of the essence of it in here. It gives a good history of how they've developed, and I think what most, certainly white South Africans, for that matter black South Africans, really have been shielded from a lot of that because it just doesn't come up in our media as much as it should, or maybe it should. As I say, the numerical following is very indistinct, so it's not clear as to precisely how much you should attach to it. Anyway, then the HNP, again, there's a debate as to whether there really is a delineation between the HNP and the CP. There is an historic one, which is legitimate, and then there's a considerable personality one. That is, the HNP leadership tends to be more, if you like, ordinary, everyday Africana conservative people, whereas the CP leadership tend to be Africana intellectuals like Schoenecht himself. But the historical division is more legitimate, and that is the HNP hived off from the National Party over the reforms taking place in the late 70s, 1977 and 76, for example, the introduction of 99-year leases, the creation of black urban councils, which were regarded by them as bringing about black permanence in urban areas, as amounting to devolution of power to blacks, which they opposed. The CP broke away much later over much more, from their perspective, much more of a sellout or reform position. The CP broke away over the creation of essentially the tricameral parliament, the bringing of Browns and Indians into government, and since then they have flirted and fought with each other, and they are now in these coming by-elections contesting some of the constituencies together and some separately. Whether they ever will join with each other seems doubtful in the near future. It seems as if the differences as they perceive them are substantial enough to justify staying apart. Then, of course, the National Party, I think the NP, NRP, PFP, I was going to say that we all know enough about them, so I don't need to explain their position, but often that's not the case. I mean, for example, how many people really know what the NRP's policy is? And in what sense is the NRP different from, say, the Nats or the PFP? To a Nat, the NRP seems close to the PFP, and to a PFP, they can't imagine why they haven't merged with the Nats yet. Well, I think the National Party now is in a state, as we all know from the famous or notorious Rubicon speech, where it does itself not declare where it's going. We are, by its own unambiguous statement, going into an era of change, constitutional development, as it's called, or constitutional reform, economic reform. There's some very confusing developments. There's steps forward, steps backwards. The constitution that we voted on, had a referendum on, it did bring about a certain amount of devolution, which people thought was in the right direction, even if it was too little, too late, or whatever. Then now the new regional services councils amount to more centralization, which seems to go against the declared reform policy of the government. And my own view, rightly or wrongly, and if there are any staunch insiders of the National Party, then please correct me if I'm wrong, or people who know differently, is that within the National Party, in a state of flux necessarily, there's a great deal of uncertainty and confusion amongst even the hierarchy as to precisely what is going on. Well, what is meant by the policy of free enterprise that's been articulated? Does this mean a removal of racial barriers to trade, for example, or does it just mean deregulation, or does it mean privatization? Does it mean less tax? In fact, we've been getting more tax. We've been getting more civil servants, bigger government. So I think even within the hierarchy, maybe even within the cabinet, there's a great deal of uncertainty now as to precisely what National Party policy is. My own dealings with ministers suggest to me that there are amongst them quite significant differences as to what is meant by change, what is meant by reform, what are the ultimate objectives. And it's for this reason that, amongst others, that the President does not want to give some blueprint for the future or whatever. And it's for that reason, frankly, that I think people of goodwill can make major contributions to solving the problem, because I think none of these groupings here really have a clear view at the moment on what they're in favor of. None of them, I'm going to come back to that, as you'll see at the end, they have very clear as to what they're opposed to. In other words, we know that they're opposed to mixing with blacks, they're opposed to mixing with whites, they're opposed to white government and apartheid, they're opposed to the black domination and the erosion of minority rights, etc. We know what every group opposes. It's what I call opposition politics paradigm in South Africa. but there's very, very, very little certainty about what people want. The same is true of the PFP. In fact, the PFP, and I know the members of the PFP are very active and keen members, and forgive me if I sound insulting, I don't mean it to be. But in a sense, the PFP has a contradictory policy. On the one hand, it says that what we need is a national convention, the Convention Alliance, which it's just promoted, and a fairly open-ended convention. In other words, we're just assuming we can get legitimacy to this convention, which I don't know how many of you have thought about whether that's possible. The convention sounds like a nice idea, but if you were actually asked to convene it, I personally have very severe doubts about its political practicality. I can't imagine that you could get people there who would, they couldn't get Tutu and Buthelezi who fall very close to each other. I mean, they're right there in the middle together. They couldn't get them together at the Convention Alliance. Now, what chance has this convention got of getting legitimacy across that spectrum? I have very serious doubts about the utility of that. But anyway, at the same time, it does have a federal policy. It's got some quite intricate propositions relating to, it's got an economic policy platform and various other platforms which are quite articulated in quite some detail in their literature and at their party speeches. Now, are these two reconcilable? In other words, if you vote for the PFP and the PFP comes in, what have you actually voted for? You voted for a party that has said we've got a lot of policies, but as soon as we get in, we're going to abdicate and hand over to whoever attends the convention. So it's a sort of abdication policy on the one hand, and yet an appealing sort of liberal democratic policy on the other. Now, I've spoken to various PFP people, and I don't get a clear answer as to what is wrong with that analysis of PFP politics. Maybe members here would help us. Then you get in Carter, which holds itself out as a non-racial, non-ethnic, cultural group, but clearly it is a political group. It is ethnic and it is racial. That is, it is overwhelmingly black. It is 85%, roughly 85% Zulu. It has never really made any major effort to recruit members outside of Zulu constituencies or areas. Some people believe it would be very successful if it tried to. The leader of its youth brigade happens to be a Sotho. There are many Sothos, a number of Sothos high up in the, or non-Zulus high up in the hierarchy. But nonetheless, it is, the PFP thinks that it's the black equivalent of the PFP, and Carter thinks that the PFP is the white equivalent of it. And, but they do have differences, obviously, and there's some possibility of, as we know, of them getting on together, but on the other hand, it is very visibly and distinctly ethnic and racial and even geographic, confined overwhelmingly to KwaZulu. I think blacks who are not Zulus but moderates, perhaps more moderate than, say, the UDF, find themselves in an awkward situation. Do they now support in Carter, which, I mean, maybe you can tell us if this is your experience, the blacks with us, but it seems that a moderate black doesn't really have a clear grouping onto which they can attach themselves other than in Carter, in which they find themselves swamped by Zulus if you're not a Zulu. Then there are the liberals, who are largely whites. The Liberal Party dissolved itself. Alan Paton was probably the most famous member of the Liberal Party. The Liberals originally were sort of classical liberals, not too different from, say, Libertarians or the Federalists led by Jan Lombard at the moment. The Liberals dissolved themselves with a political interference law in terms of which people of different races could not belong to the same party. That was the reason given. It was probably also simply the party was weak, didn't have many members, didn't have much money, and of course there always are, for any given effect, a number of contributing causes. Then the UDF, the United Democratic Front, claims an affiliation, is probably correct, I don't know if it's easy to verify, of 600 bodies ranging from very small insignificant to very sizable ones, an extraordinary cross-section, trade unions and so on. They, if those bodies don't entail double counting, in other words, if there's one person who's a member of three, say of a trade union and of COSAS and of say the civic association or whatever, if you might be a member of 3 or 4 or more of the bodies that belong to the UDF. But let's assume there's no double counting, that no single person belongs to more than one of the constituent bodies or affiliated bodies. They've got about 1 million members, which is about the same as in Carter, so they're roughly the same in size. Whether the following is the same, in other words, if there was a referendum or an election, I think most people think the UDF would come in with a much bigger support amongst blacks than in Carter, especially with the popularity Bishop Tutu gained that gave the UDF, to which the SA Council of Churches is affiliated, a lot of previously of credibility it never had previously. The various civic associations, the Committee of 10 and so on, belong to it. I've added in here, by the way, the various homeland political parties, the black parties in the national states, independent and non-independent, the urban councils, the House of Delegates, House of Representatives, would fall within this sort of grouping in the middle here. And they would be the non-whites then, if you'd excuse the term, people other than white who correspond to the whites and the blacks over here. Those do not involve the homeland parties, of course, include KwaZulu would include the Inkatha people. Then there's a new phenomenon in South Africa, and although there's no organized movement, no organized grouping, it certainly is making a lot of dust and a lot of visibility, as we saw recently with the publication by ASACOM of the report of the Pretoria University academics Lombard, Dupisani, the BIPA, actually, the Bureau for Economic and Political Analysis, Bureau for Economische and Politica Analyse. There's a tremendous movement amongst federalists and libertarians, for lack of a better word, people like Lombard, like Geert de Wet, like Brian Cantor, like Michael O'Dowd, like myself, call ourselves libertarians, and people like this are having an impact or visibility that is disproportionate with their numbers, and disproportionate given that they actually don't have an organized institution. But they certainly are getting a lot of prominence. If you remember, Jan Lombard's office was bombed, some suggested by the Weerstandsbeweging, and people obviously believe that the impact these people are having is significant enough to want to bomb them, to quote them, to report broadly on them, and to consult with them at various levels, for example, inviting them to the Alliance meeting and so on. The Liberals now probably still exist as an informal movement. They still are a pressure group. They still distinguish themselves from the PFP, but I think are a declining force in the scheme of things. The UDF, as I was talking about, is a growing force, very influential, hitherto unbanned. And it must be distinguished, the Committee of 10, that's Dr. Motlana's group, now really called the Civic Association, since they've spread from Soweto to other areas, must be distinguished from the Committee of 20, which is a sort of moderate version of the Committee of 10 and has various associations outside of KwaZulu. So when you hear of the Committee of 20, the media often does not distinguish between these two, but they are quite different. The one is radical and the one is moderate. The one is for example, the Committee of 20 in the various national states supports the national states government. To the Committee of 10, they would be regarded as sellouts or stooges or whatever, pro-apartheid blacks. Or as they call them amongst themselves, they talk about them as Bantus, as a sort of insult to the blacks who collaborate or cooperate with the system. The National Forum, the UDF, just let me go down here and make the observation, of course, that the UDF has been regarded as the Prime Minister and others have suggested probably an internal front to legitimize or legalize in effect the ANC. Umkhonto weSizwe is simply the, if you like, the defense force or the army of the ANC. It's a term one uses not a separate political organization, it's simply their military wing under their direct control, or so it seems, or even that's not always clear. That may or may not be true. What is true is, as the asterisk shows, is they both subscribe to the Freedom Charter, and that certainly does bring them into make them look similar. Those would be then exterior. There's an internal underground wing of the ANC, but one presumes that their members will somehow work their way into the UDF. Then you have the National Forum. Now, the National Forum is black consciousness. It includes COSAS, that's the Students' Association, which includes university students and school children, all black. They're very racist. They are black consciousness. Really, it intrigues me that the Western world has not regarded black consciousness as a form of apartheid. It seems that when whites are in favor of maintaining some kind of white exclusivity, it's regarded as offensive and unacceptable in the form of apartheid. But when blacks do the same, it has not attracted criticism from the liberal or the international media. For some reason, that's regarded as legitimate, but when essentially the same is adopted by whites, it's regarded as illegitimate. ZAPO is affiliated to National Forum. The PAC probably would affiliate to National Forum, which is a black version of the UDF, which is multiracial. It's a more radical or left-wing version. The UDF is more moderate, and so that's where they fit in. Then the ANC was banned. It's probably, if I mean, anyone can contest this, no one knows, but it seems to me that if there was an out-and-out election in South Africa now, or referendum right now, my guess is the ANC would get a majority, would come in with something like, well, certainly in excess of 50% of the black vote, probably not much different from what Mugabe got, 62% to be precise, in Zimbabwe. That's highly contested. Many people, of course, people, moderates and conservatives, suggest that the ANC doesn't have the following which it claims, and the more left-wing you are, the more willing you to concede that it does have a significant following. Then the ANC really is itself, although it says it's non-racial and parades itself as opposing apartheid and opposing racial groupings, interestingly, it is constituted on racial lines, which is something that is not often recognized. It is comprised of, for example, the Colored Persons Congress, the various regional Indian congresses, the Congress of Democrats, which is whites, so coloreds or browns, Indians and whites, who form then the Congress Alliance, which joins with black members who are the ANC itself, as these separate groupings. It's sort of almost like, ironically, if you don't mind me saying, it's almost like the NRP's view of how the country's constitution should look. The NRP would like to see a fourth black house of parliament as being sort of its constitutional objective. Now, ironically, that is how the ANC is organized, with, in a sense, four houses representing the four major ethnic groups. The PAC, as I said, broke away initially because they decided that there was no way blacks could get on with whites, and they became a black consciousness or black-dominated group. And then there's the Communist Party, after which I put question marks. To what extent the Communist Party, now banned, still functions internally is hard to assess. There are political analysts who know, I don't. People like Duncan Innes and various communist academics are presumably members of the party. I hope that's not a libelous thing to say. Certainly they would know more about it. And again, what kind of following it has, I don't know. My own view is that it has mercifully little following. And the very fact that people like the ANC and the UDF are as popular as they are amongst people who see themselves to be the militant radicals suggests that the Communist Party, certainly as far as blacks are concerned, is almost non-existent. And I think that's a thing that many of us can take some comfort in. This lack of clear Marxist communist thinking is something that's not often apparent in South African political discussion. Then I said the most extreme left is probably the Marxist workers' tendency, and it's even difficult to establish whether it still exists. It is hardcore. It really is the black version of the Afrikaanse weerstandsbeweging. You can almost call it the swart weerstandsbeweging, or you could call them the Marxist Workers' Bond or something. Anyway, but you could play around with that. But they really are the mirror image of the Afrikaanse weerstandsbeweging. very staunchly anti-white, pro-black, pro-Marxist, whatever. And again, ironically, the two of them should find easy accommodation with each other. But they see each other as polar enemies. Now, to move on to the other groupings, which maybe one should intersperse with those because of the degree of politicization of trade unions, is the labor movement. The mine workers, with Ari Paulus as the distinctive figure there, is perhaps the most right wing of the labor movements. It's a little difficult now because amongst the SACLA or Confederation of Labor, that's the white-dominated, if you like, the racist collection of unions on the right, there's a lot of change taking place. For example, the railway union, which as little as a year ago you might have wanted to put at the top, has recently become non-racial and now admits black members. I think they call themselves the Spoorbond or something like that. But anyhow, the mine workers union, the iron and steel workers union, the railways and various public sector unions, municipal unions and so on tend to be white dominated and in a state of considerable flux. The ones that are really holding on hard to job reservation, influx control for Vuti and apartheid are the mine workers union. These others are in various degrees of moderation, one can say, from that extreme position. Then you get Taxa, which has the biggest affiliation. When I say the biggest affiliation, let me make the observation that South African trade unions also, like perhaps all the groupings in South Africa, have an impact that is disproportionate with their numbers. There are only 15% of the workforce is unionized, and that's in the RSA. If you include the 10 homelands come national states, it's probably somewhat less, like 11% or so. Which is very, very low. It's one of the lowest in the world. The UK is around 50%, France is around 80%, America is low, America is 20%, but that's very unusual. Canada is, most Western democracies are up around 50 to 80% of the workforce being unionized. Japan is about 30%. Japan is low. Sorry? I don't have any idea what they are. I'm not sure that there are many third world countries that permit a free union movement. There are some like, of course, the Far Eastern, Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines have a free union movement. South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, I think, are fairly sizable. They're probably around 20 to 30%. Hong Kong is very low. It's only 5%. And there are various reasons for that. The reason is that the Hong Kong Union is part of the Red Chinese Union movement. And Hong Kong wages are like 10 times as high as Chinese wages. So there's very little motivation for a Hong Kong worker to join a union which is trying to get minimum wages up to a tenth of what they're earning. So really the only motive for a Hong Kong person to join a union is really a political statement. It's not really a serious union movement. But I don't know about other third world countries like South America and so on. But it is very low, lower than 15%. That's of the formal workforce. We have a very big informal sector, so it's still lower if you take that into account. But Taxa nonetheless is the biggest with about, I think, 117 affiliated unions or so. That means something like about 200,000 workers, you might know. And it's not important, the figures precisely, but it is non-racial, it is moderate. It's even had me as a speaker at an annual congress, and I got the biggest ovation they said they've had in their history, so you've got to see that there's a lot of hope over there. They have recently lost the Boilermakers Union, which is the biggest single union, I think, in South Africa. But I must distinguish, by the way, that is a federation of unions, Confederation of Labour. Taxa is a federation of unions. It's not a trade union as such. And for SATU, CUSA, and SAWU, there are 4 federations of union in South Africa. I should have made this more clear. Of any consequence, 4 large ones, and they are these. I'll underline them in green: Taxa, FOSATU, and CUSA. The others are trade unions proper, in other words, members of directly belonging to the union rather than unions belonging to the national body. Okay, then the Boilermakers have moved towards the left. They regard taxa as too moderate in terms of its racial policy. They say it's still too dominated by whites, although taxa claims, and I think it's probably correct, that they just are non-racial. They just have people moving ahead on merit or whatever. For SATU is the trade union equivalent of the UDF, non-racial. The most prominent person is Cyril Ramaphosa of the National Union of Mine Workers, recently organized these strikes. The National Union of Distributive Workers is another one. They're really in the UDF camp. CUSA is a black consciousness union association, doesn't accept white workers, and really is the labor equivalent of the Pan-African Congress. SAWU and the GAWU and others are really more like political parties than unions, and it's not clear to me what their delineations are. In a lot of this, that's the union of the media union, which is I list separately because it is far left, socialist, communist members. That's a peculiar union because it includes everything from journalists to messengers who work in the media business. So that is the union thing from left to right, which is now so very politicized that I think in any political analysis of South Africa, you have to regard them almost as political parties or groups. Now, if you add this to the ones I gave you before, I won't go into what those other unions are, you see that South Africa is really divided up into a whole lot of splinters of non-representative organizations and people. Which I think is actually partly its strength. There, in the absence of some very clear, the groupings are, as I said, very splinter. They're characterized by their opposition politics. That is what they oppose. That is what is known about every political grouping in South Africa, what they're against. We know very little about what any of them, even the major white parties, the National Party, the PFP, are for. Now, this is a very strange situation. If you read the manifestos, we're against racial discrimination, or we're against domination of whites, or we're against monopoly capital, or we're against this or that. They are non-representative numerically. If you take the South African population as a whole, the biggest number that any can claim, the UDF and Inkatha, 1 million, is a 25th of the South African population, or between, say, 30 million virtually. So we've got lots and lots of little divergent groups, none with any clear direction, none with any clear policy, none with any delineation, none that we really know what they're for. What they do have in common, which the PFP supposedly is not in favor of, but really is, I think, if you look at it very closely, is for a unitary state. And this, I believe, is the fatal flaw currently pervading all South African politics. People talk about devolution, but nobody really thinks about what that means. I was on TV the other night with Tony Bloom, who said that they and the ANC could not agree on the economic policy. And my view is, well, why were they trying to agree? Why weren't they rather trying to say, well, can't we really have a situation in which you can have your policy and we can have our policy? After all, they are all three, the business people there, businessmen there, are supposed to be prominent PFP people, and if they really are progressive federal party members, they should not be talking about an economic policy. Surely federalism, surely devolution means different policies, and everybody, the Nats, everybody, in fact the Nats are now almost overtaking the PFP as being a pro-federal party, pro-devolution party, but very few people seem to have registered what the word means or entails, what the consequences of such a policy. And this leads us to a deadlock. The fact is that if all of these groupings are thinking in terms of one day, one of them is going to take over this giant carrot that we're all fighting about, and then they are going to simply impose their will on everybody else, I think they're all mistaken. I simply think that is unrealistic and will never happen. It's going to be an escalating bloodbath so long as that is the assumption that every one of these splinter groups makes. The truth is that I think we should be able to readily see that what we do have is a multi-optional situation, not a winner-takes-all situation. We should have, instead of opposition politics, pro-politics. And I think those of us who can start articulating what we're in favor of can really win the day. There's a big vacuum in the whole of South African politics as to what's to come. And anyone who articulates that well, and that is why someone like the Lombard Group, really two academics at Pretoria University, are kicking up as much political dust as entire political parties with 1 million members, because they are actually talking about what they want to see rather than what they oppose. And I think that's a very good thing. It seems to me that is why they have the impact they have. There's a collectivist paradigm that all of these people seem to have, that somehow it's group think rather than individual think. And to go back to the cliche I used last time, that we should think in terms of diversity is strength, not unity is strength. What are the problems to bringing about some kind of pro-politics or politics of what people support rather than what they oppose? Or bringing about some kind of accord between all those political groupings. It seems, as I said, it seems as if you should be able to get the PAC and the ZAPO and the Afrikaanse Weerstandsbeweging to agree with each other. I mean, objectively, it's very hard to see on what account they don't. Well, what are the problems? Firstly, the obvious problem is that most of the black groupings believe that because of the historic disadvantage and discrimination they've suffered, there has to be a kick-off with a massive wealth redistribution. They see it almost as if we're running a race, we're going around the track. They have been held at the starting line here, the whites have gone halfway round, and now we say, well, all right, let's let them go, and they say, but that's unfair. The whites must come back to the beginning, and then we'll run the race, equal start, whatever. That's a perspective. My own view is that you just end up with everybody being less of the way around the track if you do that. You don't help the poor by destroying the rich. You don't help those who have progressed by pulling down those who have not progressed, however unjust the system was that stopped them progressing. You don't bring about justice by redistributing poverty. The redistribution of wealth is actually a myth, of course. It never has achieved it and never can achieve it. But nonetheless, that is a very strongly held view. In the Freedom Charter, one of the unambiguous objectives is a redivision of the land justly, by which presumably they mean expropriating large tracts of white farmland and selling it off to blacks. This is the type of policy that Mugabe has tried to institute. I think they've abandoned it. It was a similar sort of thing, but I think they have seen, to their credit, and maybe this is why Zimbabwe is actually not becoming so much of a banana republic as one might expect. They have not actually been implementing their policy. They have actually even done some deregulation and privatization of land and very little wealth redistribution. They've got some very poor things like the artificially high minimum wage, but basically the reforms they have made have not corresponded to their election platform, certainly not to Marxism. The other one is domination, obviously from white groups, or most white groups, or certainly the conservative or mainly Africana white groups. They will not agree easily to something that will entail them losing control over themselves. But maybe, and of course they want to maintain their identity, but maybe there is an accommodation to be reached along the lines of where they can have their areas, their cantons, their states or whatever, realistically located geographically, in which they can maintain their separateness politically and even socially. That could satisfy them, I think, relatively easily, and indeed the most right-wing groups have already started pushing for some such solution. They no longer envisage a sort of indefinite Baaskap or Verwoerdian ideal. The wealth redistribution thing really is a problem. I think most of the people in this room would probably agree to a little bit of wealth redistribution, but certainly dig their heels in against a lot, not because they believe that it is that there's been no injustice, but simply because most of us here don't believe it works. If it worked, I think a lot of us would be for it. But all the evidence at our disposal suggests that wealth redistribution doesn't help the people it's intended to help. The black American economist Thomas Sowell put it quite well when he said that the welfare programs are a gold mine. After the poor have been studied, researched, monitored, relocated, housed, documented, many a middle-class liberal has become rich on government funds, which is true. And if you look at the redistribution figures in places like the USA, the welfare budget entails something like $20,000 per family defined as poor, per family of 4. They in fact receive between 3,000 and 4,000. The remaining 17,000 to 16,000 gets gobbled up by the bureaucrats in the administration who drive Mercedes-Benzes and BMWs and Cadillacs. And that is in fact what Thomas Sowell has been pointing out. That is the real world. So we would need to persuade the black groupings in some future, long-term future arrangement or accommodation that some of the black grouping, and Carter isn't for this sort of thing, but UDF is moderately for it, and then the more left-wing ones are more strongly for it, but one would have to persuade them that it's really killing the goose that lays the golden egg. But in the end, one might have to accept, as happened in Sweden for different reasons, that you might be able to bring about some kind of relatively free economy and democratic order with lots of wealth redistribution, and if the economy is free enough, it seems to be able to produce and afford the wealth. The wealth redistribution is a luxury which can be afforded if you have a free and productive enough economy. The hope, the poverty, I think I've outlined. There's no direction, the opposition politics, the splinter groupings, the non-representativeness, etc. The hope really is the fact that there is this lack of vision. There is this vacuum into which people with vision, with a plan, can move. And the plan which will come out in my next session is the one I think that is the most appealing, and that's why I would present it. And I think most of you here anyway go along with it. Some kind of, if you like, a Swiss canton approach, I think is quite easy and should be readily acceptable to most. Just to give you an idea of the lack of unity, of vision, of cohesion, at the height of the boycotts, November 1984, of the school boycotts, about 7% of school children participated. The percentages that are given as higher, ironically, by the government's own Department of Education, exclude the 10 black national states, in which two out of every 3 students are. But if you include all the black youth in RSA prior to the national states, it turns out actually that COSAS has a surprisingly small following, even though that has appeared to be the strongest so far. It's got more done than any of the unions or any of the political parties or whatever. But nonetheless, it's only 7% of the students that it could mobilize. The other thing in our favor, I think, is world trends. Throughout the world, in the communist bloc in particular, Red China, Russia, the very countries that the radical left, the Marxist groupings look to as their sources of inspiration, have themselves abandoned Marxism. There is a massive retreat back into capitalism, free market, classical liberalism, libertarianism, whatever you like to call it. The myth that the state can produce wealth, can produce justice, can produce equality, simply is dying, I believe. I think it's clear, is dying worldwide, east and west. Every now and then you get some Western country that elects as nominally socialist or Marxist government, like Italy and France. But actually ironically, Italy right now, with a socialist the left-wing government, and people haven't noticed this because it's a left-wing government, is outpacing Thatcher at privatization and deregulation. They've introduced a small business deregulation act similar to, or along the lines of the ones we had introduced in the Siskai. I was in Rome airport 3 weeks ago reading the local newspaper all about the privatization of their telephone system. They're selling off another 30% of the shares. It's quoted on the stock exchange. So really, even the socialist parties, and by the way, the reason I had to cancel that one, I went to consult with the government, which is a socialist left-wing government. The conservative right-wingers are out of power, and the socialist left-wing government, having read about the Cisco success story in the Wall Street Journal, wants to implement those policies in that country, so that even the socialists are now almost outperforming the free market people, Reagan, Thatcher and co, at their own game. In communist China, they now have private roads, privately owned toll roads. Massive privatizations, deregulations, backtracking, and really it's hard nowadays to find a socialist or Marxist who still sticks to their policy. I was at a conference at Wits University a month ago where the country's leading academic socialists were, and all four of the formal program speakers, Jeremy Keenan, Gelb, whoever they are, doesn't matter, David Lewis and Van Onselen, and one or two others, not one of them, when asked by people, does socialism produce development? Does socialism have a development strategy? Every single one said no. They said they used to think so, but they now have to recognize that it doesn't, and they are going back to the drawing boards and thinking of new methods, worker communes or cooperatives or something. But currently, socialist intellectual thought is in a state of collapse in its real-world relevance. They still have a vision that's the same, perhaps, but I think the world trend is definitely away, and this must be known to people in the ANC, etc. And I think that it probably, sitting around a table, will be much easier than people think. My own experience with meeting with some of these people, which is now known because I mentioned it on TV, is actually fairly optimistic. It's surprising how uncommitted they are to the policies which the radical right thinks, or the conservatives or the whites generally think they have. And often the posturing which is taken, that people are, that these groups are all against each other, we must not as ordinary people be misled. Often it's really the megalomania, the status seeking, the power objectives of the leaders in these groups. It's personality clashes often more than ideology clashes. And then attitudinal change. I think this is very significant. I know that to black South Africans or South Africans of colour, it seems as if so little has changed. And very few whites realize why it seems as if so little has changed, because they're still faced with the same bureaucrat, the same insult, the same rudeness, the same system for home allocation, the same system for labour bureau system, influx control, whatever, in their black areas. What the whites see is that hotels that used to be white are now mixed, and restaurants are now mixed, and schools are allowed to integrate, etc. So the whites, as they see it, see that things have changed. You can marry across the colour bar, and Browns and Indians are in parliament. In the white world, things are very different from what they were 10 years ago. But in the black world, things are not very different from what they were 10 years ago. This is why there's this different perception. But what I think is important is how remarkably whites have adjusted to racial mixing, which 2, 3, 4 years ago, those very same whites would have considered completely outrageous and out of the question. For example, the Railway Workers Union General Secretary, I forget his name, 3 years ago was absolutely rigidly adamant that there is no way in which they would tolerate any integration, in which they was absolutely committed to the Verwoerdian ideal and dream, doctrinaire, bigoted, whatever you like to call it. A few months ago, that very same person stood up and announced on a public platform why it is essential for the Railway Workers Union to stop being white and to take in black members. Now he is sitting around a table with equals in his union, which 3 years ago he would not have considered possible. I mean, he would have, if it said that could happen, he'd have just said, you outrageous, I'd rather commit suicide or whatever. But I think that is the significant thing, is that the propensity of people to change their attitudes is quite extraordinary. And just a personal little experience, which might not seem politically or grandly significant, but I think it is. I play rugby, or used to play. I don't play for them anymore. For a very, very, if you like, verkrampte southern suburbs rugby team called Zuidelike Voorstede, of all places. You might wonder why I play for them, but it's another story. Anyway, I mean, you could not have found a more racist, working class, white Africana group of people if you tried, who to them, I mean, the word Catho was not intended as an insult. It was just what people who are black are called. They just was part of their language. Then 4 years ago or so, when rugby became integrated, we played against a black team, and the game was just like any other game, and we end up sitting in the pub, and they get to know these people as John and Peter and Paul. They're no longer the fellow who cleans the rubbish bin or brings the tea or whatever. And literally within a year, these people changed from one extreme to the other. And I often wonder what went on in their own minds. I mean, are they aware of what's happened to them? But I think that is something that is impressive and on our side, is that attitudes can change. Attitudes not so much to race, which is what I'm talking about, but attitudes to politics. Is the whole assumption that we need one solution, one outcome, one system, I think can be changed very easily. That is the end. And when I've said easily, I'm going to close there with a story. You wanted story, so here's a story. These two actually, one happened to me and one didn't. But I'm going to tell them both in the first person. On my way here, the first time I came to this building, I got lost, and I stopped to ask someone the way. And he said to me, well, what you must do is you must go on 3 blocks and then you turn left, you see. And I said, and then he said, no, wait a minute, no, you must go left, through the dip, around the corner. No, wait, he said, actually, no, you must go back where you've come from. About 2 kilometers, you'll see some trees. No, actually, wait. He said, you must go right. He said, you go right, there's a big building over. No, actually, he said, if you want to go there, you shouldn't start here. Well, that was the one. The other one was when I was a little boy, we got lost in the Kalahari. And my father stopped to ask an old Madala the way, you see, and he said to him, I'm going to tell this in Afrikaans, he said, waar gaan hierdie pad? That's how it happened in Afrikaans, waar gaan hierdie pad? He looks at my father like this, and he says, hierdie pad. My father says, ja, waar gaan hierdie pad? He says, hierdie selfde pad. My father says, ja, waar gaan die pad? He says, hierdie pad waar jy nou langs gekom het. He says, ja, waar gaan hierdie pad? Hy skop die stof so. He says, hierdie pad. Now, there's only one pad for 100 mile, you see. Hierdie pad. He says, ja. He says, nee, hierdie pad, hy gaan nie, hy bly hier. Now, anyway, what I believe is that if that's where we want to go, this isn't the place to start. But I think we're on a road that goes and not one that stays. Thanks for listening.
Field his own questions because I have to run. Will you excuse me, please? And he's very good at fielding his own questions.
To what extent do you feel that the recent moves by countries from, let's say, the Western world, or Western trends, reflects hope?
I think considerably. I think that. Again, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Kathy, I think your name is, that I think most black South Africans identify quite strongly with American blacks. They identify really with the West. And I think the trends in the Western world are much more important than the trends in the Eastern Bloc. But I think the trends in the Eastern Bloc are important at influencing the very small group of political leaders on the radical left, if you like, Mandela and Oliver Tambo and so on. I think people like that. I was told by Mugabe himself, incidentally, that before he took office, after they had won the election, he said, the one thing I know we don't want over here is Marxism, because I've seen it in Mozambique. And also, Michel had told him that it's a failure. If you remember, Michel said he's introducing capitalism, by which he thought means that anyone who doesn't make a profit should go to jail. That's how he announced it. Originally, when he came in, he said anyone who makes a profit will go to jail. Since he then decided Marxism doesn't work, he decided the opposite has to happen, and that anyone who doesn't goes to jail, which is supposedly now why all these people are in corrective detention because they weren't making enough profit. But no, that is true. I think that the Eastern Bloc certainly will, the developments there are cardinal at moderating or de-radicalizing or whatever the radical leading groupings. But the vast majority of blacks and whites look to the West, and I think in our own country we can see quite clearly what impact Thatcherism, Reaganomics and other developments, Joe Clark in Canada, Fraser in Australia and so on, have had on white thinking. So I think it's absolutely cardinal. If the Keynesian era was still with us, we would not be able to shift the South African scheme of things the way that it's now possible to do.
What about the imposition of sanctions? Do you find that encouraging?
Well, I've got a sort of unorthodox position on the whole sanctions issue. Firstly, I think international pressure does seem to work. I think it's wrong of the government, frankly. I mean, if I was in the cabinet, I would say to them, you know, I wouldn't work this way. But the fact is there is a high correlation between sports boycotts and reforms in sport, between the Soweto riots and the introduction of Urban Council's 99-year leases black trading rights, between the current riots and the current reforms, etc. So, sadly, the government does give in, does reform in response to unrest and pressure. That's not how it should function, but it's the way it functions, it seems. And so, to the extent that one wants things to change, therefore, the sanctions pressure might receive the support of people. I mean, it's assumed that if you're white, you've got to be against sanctions. But now the other thing about the sanctions is what effect are they likely to have? And there I think we've exaggerated the other way. We're so neurotic about the thought that we'd have sanctions imposed on us, and really I think if you try and quantify it, the impact would probably be quite minuscule. We were just at an Economic Society conference where a very good paper was read by an economist down there, Mike McGrath, on the impact of sanctions, and he came out with suggested figures that were much higher than I thought. If effective sanctions were imposed by the whole world on South Africa, that is a total block on capital, a total block on trade, I think he said it would reduce our growth by 15%. In other words, if we were going to have 10%, we're now going to have 8.5%. If we were going to have 5%, we're now going to have 4% or whatever. In other words, the effect, even in what I think was suggested much more impact, he did a static analysis, was trivial. I think the real effect is likely to be even less trivial, and the ability to impose sanctions is almost non-existent. So I think we respond far too flatteringly to the pressure groups for sanctions. But I do think that, in other words, we think that the threat is serious. I don't think so. In the sense that the threat is serious in the sense that we might get sanctions, but it's not serious in the sense that I don't think it's likely to have much effect. A fall in the gold price of $1 or a rise in the gold price of $1 I think is likely to have a more effect on us than US sanctions on new investments, for example. It's the sort of thing in economics which can't be proved or quantified. You can take your own subjective position, but that's how I read the situation. But the fact that most South Africans, the government in particular, think it's so serious, motivates them to bring about political reforms, which they would otherwise not do, or probably would not do. The other point about sanctions that I think is significant is that we're very schizophrenic. I had a journalist today, this afternoon, the last thing I did before coming here, I was talking to a journalist from the Financial Mail, who said to me, he was talking about the government's privatization plans, you see, and he said, now, wouldn't us free market people agree that the government should have nationalized or created various state corporations because it's preferable to having foreign investment, foreign control, you see. This is the argument he has been given by ISCOR and by the control boards and by various state corporations as to why they should not be privatized, because they say they would fall into foreign hands, foreign investors. So I said to him, well, you know, we do have this schizophrenia. We have self-imposed sanctions. We had during the 60s the so-called domestication policy, where insurance companies had to sell their shares to South Africans. Banks were started. Other companies were to follow. So when we're in charge of it, we think sanctions are good, and we only seem to be cross about it when someone else does it for us. It's the same with tariffs. Embargoes or sanctions on trade are a foreign country giving us tariff protection. So when we do it ourselves, we think it's good, and when someone else does it, we think it's bad. Now, I think sanctions are bad, but nonetheless, I think that's the sort of analysis we should have.
Yeah, isn't the worst problem, the gravest danger at the moment is that because of this sanctions campaign, the South African government is likely to close the economy. In other words, self-imposed sanctions is the gravest danger that South Africans are facing.
It is actually sick or bizarre that because we don't want sanctions imposed on us, the government responds by imposing them itself. It's a kind of weird thing. I can't make it sound. I can't be charitable about it. It seems that is right. There is the reaction towards reform. Not necessarily correct reform. I think there's a little confusion as to what the desired reforms are. But the economic reaction really is very serious and disastrous. Now to decide to inflate the currency, which is really what the decision amounts to, when, after all, the riots are caused by inflation. It's when the bus fares rise or the rents rise or whatever that we get, or the bread price rises, that we get riots. And then the recession is a consequence of earlier inflation. So, and then to impose a 20% surcharge on imports when the rand when we've just had effectively 100% tariff imposed due to the fall of the rand, seems like a very strange reaction. And as you say, the term is correct. It's self-imposed sanctions. We're doing it for them. Very peculiar response. I really don't understand it. I think it's quite wrong. And I think that when you call it a surcharge or when you call it job creation, putting more money into the economy, it just sounds nicer than when you call it sanctions. When the demonstrators outside the South African embassy in Washington call it sanctions, then it sounds as if we're being punished. When we call it job creation and import surcharge, it sounds as if we got a new pro-growth economic policy, but it's actually exactly the same thing. Martin.
In your talk, you were obviously taking a broad view of the political forces in the country, otherwise you would have talked about trade unions and such things. I'm surprised you didn't mention what in power terms, although it may not be exercised entirely yet, but in power terms it's the most powerful political force in the country. You didn't mention
Broederbond.
No.
Oh.
I mean the state apparatus.
Oh, yes. Yes, no, that is...
The people who run the organs of the state.
Yeah. In fact, I must add that, because you're quite right. I had thought, incidentally, that one should have the Broederbond in there, but I decided that one shouldn't, because the Broederbond itself, I don't think, is any longer a political force. It is now such a diffuse collection of people and so on. So, and I think especially amongst English-speaking people and the English media, the Broederbond is still presumed to have influence which it simply no longer has. And for that matter, actually probably never did have. I think its relevance was exaggerated by the English media. Anyhow, yes, the civil service or the state apparatus is a force of its own. And you're quite right. That has to be taken into account. It is probably, I mean, it's such a serious force of its own. Let me just mention this to you, that the reforms that the government decided to introduce in 1978 like, for example, the introduction of 99-year leases. The civil service, that is the, there's a better example. Sorry, I'm going to switch course here. The 3 Koornoff bills of about 1980 or whenever it was, or 79, the cabinet instructed the bureaucracy to draft reform legislation to eliminate what was called unnecessary or hurtful discrimination. That was the instruction given, and I could, if necessary, name the officials in the department concerned, who themselves were verkrampters, who did not like this and deliberately set about sabotaging the cabinet's decision in as far back as 1979, I think it was. And they produced those 3 bills, which, because they were in legal jargon, got all the way into the second reading of Parliament before various jurists analysed them and pointed out that they were actually retrograde. They actually introduced worse discriminations, all 3. The government then had to remove them all, considerable loss of political face, considerable embarrassment. It could not say publicly that the bureaucrats had drafted something contrary to what they asked for, because that would be admitting that they had themselves as the minister, Koornoff, could not himself stand up and say, well, I'm sorry, I wanted them to draft a law that says this, and they drafted what's before us, and I hadn't read it before introducing it to Parliament. You see, he couldn't say that.
Like signing checks with your eyes closed.
That's right. So he couldn't say that, so he had to actually just be embarrassed and withdraw those bills. Since then, they have been trying to get those same reforms through the bureaucracy and have not been able to. And I was present when one chairman of a company said to him, when he said, please, if there's anyone from the press, don't report this. But he actually said that they did not, at a meeting, a discussion I was in around tea, that they didn't draft what he said they should. And this chairman said to him, but you know, in my company, if I give an instruction and the staff don't carry it out, I fire them. I won't give you his response, but essentially the government generally, the politicians' response is, there's a shortage of staff in the civil service, they can't get qualified, competent people, if they fire them, they're left with nobody, etc., etc. In other words, they feel wrongly, I think, that they're stuck with these people, and they have to somehow get these people to do things they don't want to do. The same occurs with privatization. If you take the sale of housing in black areas, it was decided in 1978. By now, I think it's something like 10% have been sold. In the Ciskei, it was decided to sell the houses at the late April, May last year. By now, about half have been sold. So it's actually easy to do it, but the bureaucrats simply don't want to. One of the things they did, the establishment, survey. The Surveyor General and his little clique of bureaucrats and the vested interest of surveyors have simply arranged it so that every single site has to be surveyed at a fantastic cost, fantastic delay, fantastic time, whereas there are very simple ways of doing it. That's just one little technical example. Then the deeds registry officials, and you're absolutely right, the administration is a political party all of its own, which sort of has the, I can think of a graphic term which one shouldn't use in an audience like this, but it has them by the whatevers. And they can't seem to extricate themselves from it.
You must think of it in the broad sense of the word. We're not only talking about bureaucrats, we're talking about the security apparatus, the people who head the power stations.
Yeah.
The whole sort of complex. That's
Yes.
why secret the organs of the state.
Yes, very, very, very good point, and thank you. That's obviously got to get... it doesn't fit in my hierarchy anywhere, but it's sort of all on its own.
It does, Louw.
Sorry, let's go to Mr. Adams.
Actually, the whole problem with public service is that they're compressed into lower income range, and therefore they become very powerful because you can't get people to go into them.
Which is the problem?
Which is the problem. So you've got to raise the top salary in the public service several-fold. To go to my own thing about President Kruger's salary, if you're living today, would be about 6 million. Once you get that out, you get a fast-acting civil service who can be fired, and they're not political either. When they group them in a group, they're political. Trade unions do exactly the same to the new bishop. They compress them, they become much more powerful, they do them a lot of harm, really. And they should actually, we should ask trade unions to bargain for the top salaries in their groups rather than the bottom.
Well, interestingly, the most radical left wing, or one of the most radical left unions, in terms of its commitment to socialism rather than militants, the Media Workers Union, bargains for disparate salaries. That's one of the things that distinguishes it. It bargains for high salaries for the journalists and low salaries for the messengers, which is one of the many paradoxes you get in the South African political arrangements. But I think that is true. There are, of course, civil servants, probably all of us know a few of them. My father was one, who are really committed and dedicated, but they are a painfully small minority and a very frustrated minority. And we in the Free Market Foundation literally have them knocking on our door, pleading for us to do something to help. And there are some very exciting or positive developments that we're involved in, which are highly confidential, that in a sense might actually overcome this whole problem. It's surprising how a very small number of people doing the right things at the right time can outdistance hundreds of thousands of bad people by taking them by surprise. And I think by next year this time you'll know what I've been talking about. Eustace, you were saying?
The most important difference between a company and government is that the employees in the company don't elect the chairman. Civil servants are also voters, and that is why they're such a powerful force.
Yes, I think that a part of the debate should become in South Africa whether people who receive government money should have the vote, not only as civil servants, but subsidies, welfare handouts. And I don't mean that just because I'm against these people, but I think there's a very strong case in political science to be made for people not to be able to vote money to themselves. And I think you'd more likely get a much more sensible economic, social and other policies, even defense policy, if people who choose to be recipients of taxes have a trade-off against their vote. That's radical and probably not politically achievable, but it's certainly an idea which I think one should start popularizing in appropriate places. There was one other, and then I think we should...
One more point that's important.
You've thoroughly surprised me, Steve. In view of the current level of the US budget deficit, for you to say the Keynesian economics have been abandoned, you've quite surprised me.
Yes, the theory has been abandoned. It's hard nowadays to find an economist who's still a Keynesian. In a survey amongst American economists as far back as 78, I think, about 80 to 90% on a response to all American academics were surveyed. I believe it was a massive survey, academic economists. About 80 to 90% agreed on, if you like, the basic monetarist free market propositions, and Keynesianism was effectively dead as an intellectual position. By now it's even more so. There are a couple of diehards. I remember Anthony Lejeune on his London letter once spoke about this, and he said that the very last people to give it up will be the economists, because they've got a lot of intellectual capital invested in it. And that's actually true. I mean, if you're an economist who studied during the last 2 decades, you've spent all your time learning models, formulae, national accounts analysis, economic policy proposals. All that you've learnt is part of the Keynesian paradigm. And if you are now to reject that, it's rather like, you know, you've got a massive investment that you throw by the board. You've literally got to start your studies over again. You've got to say, well, now what should I know about economics? And it's very, very difficult for an economist to make such an adjustment as it would be, say, for a psychologist who's a behaviorist to decide to become an analytic psychologist or a directive psychologist or whatever, because everything you know is within that particular scheme of things. It's dead as a theory. It's dead as a serious economic theory. But it is.
Then what sustains the momentum of the current deficits?
No, but you see, one must be careful here. Deficits were not a consequence of Keynes. Keynes was a consequence of deficits. Keynes gave intellectual respectability to what kings and queens have been doing since the ancient city-states in Sumeria. Clipping coins, inflating the currency, issuing paper money on papyrus, cockle shells. The Keynesian policies are as old as money itself. It was just always accepted by everyone as being a political rip-off, as fraud, as Say's law was held to be correct, and so on. What Keynes did was to say that what politicians were doing and were universally condemned for doing was good. He said that this actually produces growth, creates jobs, etc., which is exactly now what the South African government is doing, saying it creates jobs, it creates growth. That's why we're going to throw money at the problem. But the intellectual respectability of it has gone. And certainly that will eventually manifest itself in increasing criticism from the media, the financial journalists, business people, and so on. It's got to filter through to opinion leaders, politicians, and so on. But the temptation to print money, if that's a crude way of stating the Keynesian idea, which it is, it's an oversimplification, but has always been there, always will be there. But you during the Keynesian episode, you never had any brakes on it. The brakes are back, and that's now an articulated part of most government policies, is conservative monetary policy or restraint on money growth or reduction of the deficit or whatever, even if they don't in fact do it.
Are you sure your information on Ramaphosa and the mine workers is correct? Because I'm sure there are accused of.
Sorry?
Are you sure that the Ramaphosa and the mine workers aren't accused of?
I think they are. Did I say they aren't? Oh, no. I wonder, well, it's easy to check. Yes, you're right, I did indeed. Let's check it out very quickly. 176. Yes, you're right. It is CUSA. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I think we should close and have a drink. Oh, sorry.
The uncertainties as far as the political spectrum is concerned. You mentioned that you thought that possibly the UDF might win an election on a vote basis.
ANC.
The ANC. Okay, the ANC. But if you start doing permutations, it's not clear at all, because the whites have a greater percentage of adults than in the black community. And if you do permutations, I think it's very unclear as to who will win an election, who would gain a majority. I would say it would be a matter of coalitions, and who would those coalitions be? Again, permutations make it very unclear.
Yeah, I think that the surveys that have been done, as always, if the survey is done by a conservative, then it tends to suggest a conservative public opinion, and if it's done by a liberal or left or whatever, it tends to suggest a left opinion. But the surveys do, whoever does them, tend to suggest a majority would support some kind of ANC coalition of blacks at any rate. I think that is not particularly because the blacks really, rank and file blacks, know what the ANC stands for. Probably because of the South African government's own sort of deification of Mandela. There's a sort of a sort of messiah he's become such a big figure. I personally think if he was unconditionally released, that there would be a tremendous disillusionment amongst the following that he has. I mean, when they realize, A, that he's not the great, fantastic Messiah guru that they think he is, he's got feet of clay, they'll realize he's not as radical as they thought he was. He may be out of touch, I'm not sure. But I think in a sense that what you have had is the sort of Messiah psychology amongst blacks. And I think for that reason, rather than for the ANC's political position, which very few people know, the ANC doesn't know. Different members of the ANC are entirely opposed to each other in terms of economic, social, and other forms of policy, even in terms of race policy, which is why it keeps having these breakaway groups who can't agree on what role whites should have in the ANC hierarchy and so on. So the ANC is not a position. It's a sort of random grouping of people who really are following an image, a thing. It's sort of like a messiah. I'm sure there's a better word, but I can't think of another one for the time being. But I think that's the kind of vote they'll get, which is what happened with Mugabe in Zimbabwe.
But I spoke to some people from Free State, Sesotho, and I said to them, who would win an election? They said Mandela, if he was released. So then I said to them, right, will the Sesotho's vote for him? So they said, well, no. Who would vote for him? I said, well, the cause is different. With the Zulus, no, they don't. Some may be in the cities, but generally the Zulus wouldn't vote. But the whites vote for it. Maybe a few, but generally most of them would vote against it.
Yeah.
Then I said, the brown people, well, no, they vote. Maybe some of them, but the Indian people, and so you go on by a process of elimination, and it becomes very unclear.
Could be. That's a valid point. For what it's worth, it would be interesting if there were such an hypothetical election, and if by some reason it had legitimacy, whatever, UN supervision or something. I mean, it's not going to happen, so we can just speculate. It would be interesting to see who the whites would vote for. I mean, you might get 5 million or 4 million or 3 million or whatever whites voting for Buthelezi to vote against Mandela. Like whites, many whites supported Muzorewa or Nkomo. You might also be right. I mean, one of the things that is commonly underestimated amongst urban blacks and urban people generally, including journalists, is the degree of real support and popularity that the homeland or national state governments have amongst rural people in the villages, who are perhaps a third or almost a half of the black population. I mean, that is real genuine support there, and real genuine loyalty to the tribal system. So I think I'd need to reconsider that idea. That is what has come across in the opinion surveys, but then probably you find they're urban biased. I do think, though, that whites need to be very careful about making the kind of mistakes they've made in Angola and in Zimbabwe and Zambia and so on, where they convince themselves that the blacks are not going to support the Marxists or the radicals or whatever. In Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, it was really quite amazing how right up to the end they were absolutely convinced that Muzorewa was going to win with a landslide victory. And they just refused to see the writing on the wall. And whether it was rigged or not, or whether they were scared of the black box or not, it doesn't really matter. But the point is, they simply would not accept the reality that the overwhelming vote was going to Mugabe. Right up to, until even when it was coming over on TV, they said there's a mistake. Let's have a drink and snacks, and thank you. There have been some very valuable contributions for me, for which I do appreciate.